Hello. This feels a bit like a bit of a impromptu video, but here I am, traversing the video realms right now. And I was lying in bed last night, and I have considered kind of sharing this story before, but I was lying in bed last night and this impulse came through me, and I was like, oh, I need to share this story. It must have codes for someone or something, or for me as well, probably, most likely, almost certainly. So if you're new here, welcome. My name is Shakti. I'm a mystic, poet, lady, I would say. I would describe myself as such. And yeah, so this video, as you'll see in the title, is about unlocking gifts. And this particular experience I had was kind of the culmination of a series of experiences I had which just blew me wide open. And I think that often things like that can happen, like in our life. It's like things are sort of foreshadowed and we get these clues and these hints, and then all of a sudden it kind of ruptures, something ruptures, and it opens up, and then all of a sudden we're activated. So I've shared before in my sort of journey, I think I called it like my journey part 1, and I still haven't done part 2, but I will at some point when I feel ready. And in that I had shared, and also talked about this in my last video as well a little bit, that I used to be involved in sex work, prostitution, that kind of thing when I was in my late teens and just bridging into my early 20s. And I had a series of experiences which were kind of nudging me and sort of saying to me, like, you need to stop this because this is dangerous and you're incurring all of this trauma, and you built on top of all of the trauma I had already experienced in my life. And it was like something was trying to shake me awake and go, stop this kind of thing. And I was working at a few different kind of places, and I used to sort of travel here, travel there, and go to the sort of work at these different places. And I was working at a place that I'd never worked before, and I was sort of on like a kind of trial shift basically. And I think I'd sort of told myself this story that this new place was going to be really good, and it was going to be kind of different from other places that I'd worked, and had this sort of all these kind of false ideas in my head built around this idea that this was going to be a good thing. Obviously it wasn't. And I was at a point in my career, I wouldn't really call it career, but in that line of work, I was at this point where I had incurred so much trauma, and my sort of PTSD was so high that I could no longer be nice to customers. I could no longer be nice to clients. I was so, if you've ever experienced PTSD or ever had issues with your nervous system, it's like just the tiniest little thing can just set you off. And so that was kind of what it was like for me at that time, having experienced like a number of different sexual assaults. And I was just so highly strung and in such a state of fight or flight, and was just so easily kind of triggered basically. And so I can't remember exactly what happened, but I basically ended up being sort of rude to a few customers. And obviously on your trial shift, that never looks good no matter what line of work you're in. So I had sort of gone back to my hotel that night, and I'd gotten a text message saying, we don't want to continue hiring you, essentially, because we've had some complaints from customers. And it was like I think it was like an ego thing as well, you know. It was like, I was sort of like, you know, but this is the only thing that I have, and this is the only thing which is kind of like holding my identity together. It's like the thin thread which is holding my identity together. And, you know, I always feel in this way, it was like prostitution for me was like a lifeline, but also something that caused like such a big death within me as well. You know, I'm never going to be one of those people that advocates for sex work or says, oh, but you know, there's ways that if you regulate it, it can be good. I'm never going to be one of those people, because I feel that it is in nobody's highest fucking timeline to do that kind of work. You know, if you ask a child what they want to be when they grow up, they're never going to tell you that. If you have some kind of like, you know, an idea of like your dream, usually it's not that, unless you've had a history of trauma, a history of often sexual trauma, or you don't feel that you're capable or able to do other things. You know, I understand that there are people who tell stories that it is good and that there are good things to it, but for me, it will never, especially perceiving it spiritually, energetically, I will never be one of those people. And so, you know, for me, it was the only kind of positive was that all of a sudden I had this freedom, because I'd never had a lot of money before. And all of a sudden I had all this money. Obviously I spent it all on drugs and clothes and shoes. But, you know, that was kind of, in a way, it gave me this sense of freedom. And in some ways I'm thankful for that, because after having that experience of having so much money, now I know that it doesn't make you happy. So money is never going to be like a goal for me in that way. I went so deep into the realms of materialism that I realized that it meant nothing, you know, and I realized that at such a young age as well. And so in some ways it gave me this sort of sense of freedom, because I was like, traveling around the UK, and I could buy whatever I wanted, and I realized how empty that truly was. And so in some ways it sort of gave me this lifeline, but in so many other ways it led me on this path of like deep destruction. And so I was sort of sacked from this job, right? And I think everything at that point had kind of just built up within me so much, and I just remember like crying like profusely, like crying like from the depths of my soul, like so deeply, like releasing. And I was in this like hotel and just like crying my eyes out, and I had bought a notebook from, you know, just like a random shop, and I still don't know like why I bought, well, I know why I bought that notebook, but it didn't make sense to me that at the time that I was buying a notebook, because I hadn't written anything down probably in a long time. And you know, it was like I was just writing these little lists of like things I was gonna buy, or like just random stuff in this notebook. And when I had this like what was essentially like this nervous breakdown, I just started writing, and it was like the floodgates had opened, like, and all of these poems came out of me, and it was like all of these rhymes, and like it was like everything that I had been dealing with for the past, you know, so many years, from, you know, 2 horrifically abusive relationships to then entering into prostitution, and never having dealt with any of that stuff, never having delved into like my childhood trauma or, you know, any of that. But even just in the last, you know, from the ages of sort of 16 to sort of 19, I hadn't delved into anything deeply about what had been going on with me, about all of these like horrific traumas that I'd had to my body, and the way that I'd been treated, and the situations that I put myself in. And, you know, so it was like everything came out and came to the surface. And I don't have the notebook anymore, but I literally filled up this notebook. So who knows, 50 to maybe 100 pages, I don't know, of like all of these poems. And something like released in me that night. Something opened up within me. This channel opened up within me. And I remember going outside and like sort of having like calmed myself down a little bit and going outside and like smoking this massive joint, because, you know, I used to smoke weed and do a lot of other stuff back then. But I remember sort of standing outside with this sort of like tear soaked joint and just sort of not knowing the hurdle that I'd overcome, but feeling that something had shifted within me. And, you know, in retrospect, like I totally see now that was like this part of my channel opening on this really, really deep level. And although I still was involved in prostitution for a while after that, something had shifted, and I continued to write like little poems and rhymes and just different things. And it sort of grew and grew. And, you know, obviously eventually I left prostitution, and the writing continued and continues to this day. And it had always kind of been part of me in a way. You know, I'd always kind of received praise for my writing at school and things like that, but I never, especially when it came to poetry, I never thought I could write poetry. And I think there's something about those kind of soul gifts that in the way they come through, it's always going to be like when you're at, not always, but for me with this situation, and I'm sure this is mirrored in a lot of other people's experiences, is like sometimes you have to be at that breaking point, that point where like, you know, you're so within the darkness, you're so within the underworld, but then the light just breaks through, and all of a sudden it's like you've unlocked this new part of yourself that was in some way like always there, but just hadn't been sort of coaxed out. You know, when I was at school, I never really, it wasn't, I didn't think I was good at anything, because I was, you know, I always did well in school despite my difficulties, but I just didn't have any dreams for myself. I just didn't, I think in order to have dreams for yourself, you have to have like love for yourself in some way. You have to at least feel that you have a future, and, you know, you desire a future, and oh, what does that future hold? I didn't have that. I didn't have those, you know, I was just trying to get through the day every day. And so to kind of dream of your future, it doesn't feel, it just didn't occur to me in that way. And so I never kind of thought, oh, I could do something with this, or I could do something with, you know, this thing that I'm good at, I could do something with it. And so for that to have then emerged from me when I was in such a place of, in such a like deep death process, you know, it was incredibly shamanic and such a powerful experience, and one that I still kind of, when I think about it now, it makes me like, oh my God, that was powerful. And so, yeah, I wanted to share that story, and maybe it has something for you in it, maybe not. And yeah, led me on to, you know, eventually when I was around 25, having a very quick poetry career kind of emerge out of what felt almost like nowhere, and yeah, and become a sort of published poet. And, you know, I've done loads of poetry stuff, and so yeah, I always think it's a really kind of beautiful way how that came out of me, and a story I've always been kind of afraid to tell. I think when people are like, oh, how did you get into writing? It's like, oh, well, I was sacked from the brothel and I felt like I was dying, and then all of a sudden I started writing. So yeah, so it's it's definitely a story that I think is important, because I think that we don't often hear, or we're invited to kind of dim down these kind of experiences, or it's not socially acceptable to talk about them, or it's considered, you know, something that is like dirty or wrong, or, you know, any list of words, you know, you could use to describe you know, someone kind of coming out of an experience like that. And so so thank you for listening, and I'll see you in my next video.